I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the two other works you were assigned for today. Hagia Sophia rather uses up the available oxygen. I also don't plan to repeat all of the Khan Academy information on these two works, but let me make a few points. You need to know the term illuminated manuscript. Illuminated really just means illustrated, but why was this work also luminous or lit up? Well, the writing was in silver, so it would have gleamed. Heavy use of gold and precious metals is characteristic of Byzantine work. You've encountered continuous narrative before. Think of the Last Judgment of Hunefer. This is one of the ways artists solve the problem of choosing which part of a narrative to tell. They just don't choose. So what are the more classical characteristics of this work, which is, in fact, a transitional work between early Christian and Byzantine? Well, yep, there are bodies under those clothes. We also see classical architecture, that rather intriguingly twisted bridge. Finally, the frieze structure itself suggests classical narrative. Think of Trajan's column. This makes the continuous narrative clearer. All the figures circled in green are Jacob. And I think this comparison makes the contrast between classical and Byzantine style clearer. In the portrait of Justinian and his attendants, the body shape is pretty much indiscernible. There's no real sense of movement. The figures are stiff and fully frontal. And while the figures do overlap, there's no real sense of depth either. On the other hand, the Jacob frieze lacks perspective, so while the figures are modeled, the scene is still essentially flat. It contains, in other words, Byzantine as well as classical elements. Here is the second image from the Vienna Genesis. Again, we see continuous narration. Rebecca coming to the well, and just below, her meeting with Jacob's servant and chosen representative, Eliezer. We also see a number of classical elements, which I've circled. So what are they? Well, most obviously, there's that sexy lady by the spring who appears to be a water nymph, or at least a personification of the well. Rather out of place, you would think, in a Christian book, and evidence that pagan images would persist well into the Christian era. Personifying elements of nature was part of the classical tradition. Note, too, the colonnades along Rebecca's path and the shading and modeling on the camels, which gives them a sense of depth that contrasts with the flatness of later Byzantine art. What makes the walled city, circled in green, a more Byzantine or even medieval image? Well, it's fortified, for one. These are now much more dangerous times. Pax Romana is no more. But the building also lacks proper perspective. It seems to be floating in air. These aren't required works, but I thought you might be interested in seeing more images from the same text. While the narratives show movement, the figures again seem rather stiff and stylized, although still more naturalistic than in the mosaics. You've also been looking at Byzantine images for an entire class period. You've also learned about iconoclasm, a subject that fascinates the College Board, so it'll show up on your test. If there's any time left, I'd like you to close by talking about what ties this icon to the classical world that was fading away, and what reveals an especially Byzantine worldview. Think especially about facial expressions and the position of bodies in space. But first, to close on a sadder note, Hagia Sophia ended its career as a Christian church in a bloodbath. Some reports say that the blood ran as much as 6 inches thick through the cathedral. So here's an eyewitness account. When there was no longer any resistance, the enraged Turkish soldiers roamed through the town, stealing, disrobing, pillaging, killing, raping, taking captive men, women, and children, old men, young men, monks, priests, people of all sorts and conditions. Temples were ransacked and pillaged. Sacred objects were scornfully flung aside. The holy icons and the holy vessels were desecrated. Ornaments were burned, broken in pieces, or simply thrown into the streets. When Mehmed III saw all that had perished and become ruined, then a great sadness took possession of him, and he repented the pillage and all the destruction. And then, of course, he turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque. Today it is neither a church nor a mosque, but a museum, a tribute to one of the greatest buildings ever created.